Welcome to On the Middle East, our Monitor's podcast on the big stories in the region. Things have been heating up since Hamas's October 7 attack on Israel, and no more so than yesterday when Iran-backed Shia militias killed 3 US servicemen at a base in Jordan close to the Syrian border. President Joe Biden has vowed to retaliate as he faces mounting pressure from his Republican foes. They say his weak response to sustained attacks by the Iran-backed militias has emboldened them to kill American forces for the first time. With US presidential elections just 10 months away, what are Iran's calculations? And can the Biden administration risk getting bogged down in yet another endless Middle Eastern war? Is Iran directly responsible for the attacks on US forces, or are these Shia militias using their own initiative? And how much of this really has to do with the conflict in Gaza? With us here today to discuss these questions are 2 leading experts on Iran and Shia militias. Inna Rudolph is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of Radicalization, and she's also a research fellow at King's College London, where she focuses on cross-border conflicts. Hamid Reza Azizi is a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, who closely follows Iranian policy in the Caucasus and the Middle East. Welcome to our program, Hamid Reza.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
So I'll get straight to the point. Is Iran behind these attacks?
It's, I think, as difficult a question to answer as the very famous question of whether Iran was behind the Hamas's October 7 attack on Israel. Because, as I argued on that case, I would say the same thing about the recent attack, that, in a way, Iran is and is not behind the attacks because, Iran is the main supporter of these groups and, regardless of the level of agency that some of the Iraqi militias enjoy, and that's a different matter, we can get into that later. Regardless of that, these groups used to be Iranian proxies for some time, especially in the period between 2003 and the first US withdrawal from Iraq in 2011. And they continue to rely on Iran for logistical weapon support, intelligence support, all these sorts of things. But then, based on my understanding of Iran's strategic thinking and the very fact that I still don't see any sign indicating that Iran wants to escalate against the United States in the way that it would, lead to a direct confrontation and bring the war to Iran, I think that, the latest attack was either kind of miscalculation in the sense that, those organizing it didn't expect the killing of the US soldiers, or the other option, which seems more probable to me, would be that, it is an act by the Iraqi groups to take revenge for the recent killings of their commanders and comrades over the past few weeks by the United States.
Well, you say that Iran is maybe not telling them to to carry out these actions, but at the same time, Iran is probably in a position to tell them to rein in such actions, to stop doing this, if only because it doesn't want to draw the United States into a, direct confrontation with itself. So why isn't Iran doing that? They surely have that kind of leverage.
That's absolutely true. And, it wasn't, far in the past that Iran did actually ask them to rein in. And then basically it happened, in last September, after the so-called unwritten understanding between Iran and the United States, part of which was said to be Iran trying to de-escalate with the United States in Iraq and Syria. We witnessed considerable decrease, technically a halt of the attacks against the US positions in Iraq and Syria. But then, like it or not, it has mainly to do with the overall situation in and around Gaza. And the very fact that, all these groups, there was a decision at the highest level in this network of so-called axis of resistance by Iran and its, of course, partners and proxies to escalate in the sense that, they would increase the pressure on the United States so that the US would kind of try to limit the scope of the war and push the Israelis towards, halting the war. So when there is a decision to escalate overall, then things like what happened yesterday would be only a matter of time. So there was the risk from day one when the tensions escalated and tit-for-tat attacks between Iran-backed militias and the United States, that this might happen, and then a huge escalation would come as a result. And this might be something that we are already witnessing on this day, basically.
Look, I'm not an Iran expert. You know a lot more about all of this than I do. But let's not forget that these attacks by Iran-backed Shia militias on US forces in Iraq and Syria predate October 7th. And in some ways, it's hugely convenient for these groups, for Iran, to use October 7th as a pretext to escalate when, in fact, their real target is to get US forces out of Iraq, out of Syria. And if it's a matter of avenging their comrades who were killed by the US, just hours after 3 US security forces members were killed in Jordan, you saw another attack on Shaddadi base in northeast Syria by the same groups. So this is more than just avenging deaths. There's obviously a strategy to pressure the United States to leave the region and taking it to the brink, really. There's a game of brinksmanship ongoing here, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And don't take me wrong. I'm not saying that, the confrontation between these groups and the United States or Iran and the US in the region started since October 7. I mean, we can go back and look at different turning points, which, kind of resulted in escalation or de-escalation of the tensions. As I mentioned, for example, there was an escalation already. And then as a result of the kind of agreements between Iran and the United States, things started to de-escalate. So what I'm saying basically is that the current phase is a result of the increased tensions all over the region since October 7th. So this is one thing. Another thing, as you mentioned quite correctly, the overall intention of the Islamic Republic and its allies to, so-called expel the United States from the region. Of course, it happened specifically speaking since the assassination of Soleimani in 2020. And that was, that is the official line of policy that was declared even by the Supreme Leader. So of course, they do whatever they can. But, the thing is that they're having fluctuations and changes in the way that they have been pursuing this objective. For some time, they started, of course, by escalating tensions. Then at the end of the Trump era, because of the risk of a war, more or less the same situation that we are right now, they decided to de-escalate for some time. Then they did again. And the, failure to revive the JCPOA also, played a role in that. In the next stage, they decided to go politically, basically. Iran tried to use the leverage that it had gained as a result of, a kind of government in Iraq close to itself. the Sudani government and the Shia coordination framework factions being in the government to push politically for the withdrawal of the United States. But, the thing is that all these factors are quite intertwined, especially in the context of the war in Gaza. And let's not forget that from the Islamic Republic perspective, the war in Gaza is also about the future of the regional order, and what they perceive as the final attempts by the United States to shape the region in its own image and based on its own interests, and the desire on the Iran side to resist. And that's where the word resistance basically comes from in their own literature. So yeah, these two things are quite connected. But as I said, because of the delicacy of the current situation and the high probability of a direct war because that's the red line for Iran. Iran doesn't want the country to be dragged into the war. It's a gradual policy to increase the pressure on the United States, and then in the end for the US to leave the region. That's different than that cannot be achieved by killing like 3 American soldiers. That's how I see it.
Well, let's not forget that once American blood is spilled, the United States has to react. It has to react to maintain deterrence. It has to react because of domestic pressure, because of the elections that are coming up in the United States. And surely Iran and its allies know that. So I'm still trying to understand what the point is. If on the one hand, this is all about trying to get the US out of the region, it may have the exact opposite effect of bringing the United States back much more forcefully into the region. It could, go either way.
Look, that's exactly why I said killing of the American soldiers, at least to me, doesn't seem to be part of the plan. The plan has been to increase the pressure on all these fronts, from the Red Sea and Yemen to Iraq to Lebanon, on the United States and its allies. So it doesn't fit into the context. And that's exactly why I said that the second possibility, like this specific incident being a kind of revenge taking by the Iraqis, seems more plausible to me, especially when you put it in the context of increasing grievances on the side of Iraqi militias, with regard to vis-a-vis Iran, saying that basically, especially with those more hardline groups in Iraq, like Kataib Hezbollah, like Asab al-Haq, like even Harakat al-Nujaba, which is kind of closer to Iran, in the sense that the Iraqis are getting killed. There's a very good article by Amvaj Media actually published a few weeks ago on that, explaining the scene. So that was quite expectable, and a very important statement which was overlooked was a few days ago by the head of Qatar, Sayyid al-Shahada, who said after the recent wave of US attacks killing some members of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, saying that now after these incidents, we have entered into the second phase of our confrontation with the United States. So, it very much seems like the accumulation, the escalation on the Iraqi side and the increasing urge to show that we are not just sitting idly by, and by the way, to say that we are not the Iranian proxies, we do what we do. Qais al-Khazali had an interview after the killing of Soleimani, I'm talking about 3.5 years ago, with BBC, in which he very interestingly, criticized Iran's lack of strong response to the killing of Soleimani, saying that Iran does what it does. We will take the revenge of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis ourselves. So these things show how delicate the whole thing is, and the importance of not kind of simplifying things in the sense that these are just the puppets run by Iran and things like that, which we usually see in the kind of discussion on
yes,
social media
course.
and media.
I agree, it's reductionist, and it also kind of ignores the realities of Iran, where you have different centers of power that are sometimes in competition even. And so you could perhaps argue maybe it's more the IRGC that's doing this. But setting that aside, what we see is an Iran that is increasingly aggressive, an Iran that's attacking its neighbors, Pakistan now, an Iran that is attacking civilians in Iraqi Kurdistan, killing people, civilians, business people, prominent business people, claiming they're Israeli spies. And, for the first time, we really are seeing pushback from Iraqi Kurdish leaders, for example, who remained quite silent for some time in the face of all those attacks, pushing back. And in this most recent case, Nitravan Barzani was one of the first to come out and condemn the killing of the Americans in Jordan. You saw Masroor Barzani follow suit, and you even saw the SDF commander-in-chief, Mazloum Kobani, condemning the Iranians. So the Iranians aren't really making themselves any friends here. And at the same time, one of the countries that has very important but has kind of remained neutral, Turkey, is mending its relationship with the United States. So given all of that, how would you assess Iran's current sort of stance, which seems almost like it's cornered?
Iran is in a very difficult situation in the region for different reasons. We spoke about Iran's miscalculation last time I was on your podcast, so I don't want to repeat myself on that. But as you mentioned, the incidents of Iran attacking Pakistan and Erbil, I mean, interestingly, and I would say unfortunately, from a humanitarian perspective, especially in the case of Erbil, which resulted in the killing of civilians, a very sad kind of episode. So interestingly, these actually are affirmations of the argument that Iran doesn't want to enter into a war with the United States. You know, those moves basically was, I mean, in Iran's own assessment, was meant to be some sort of reactions to everything that was happening against Iranian interests in the region from the resumed Israeli campaign of targeted assassinations that, you know, until that date had resulted in the killing of Razi Mousavi, the top IRGC commander in Syria, and then also the Kerman attack and, you know, the kind of rebels' attacks against the border guards in Iran's eastern border. So Iran wanted to show a very big and kind of strong in their own sense response to all this, but basically symbolic and in a way that it wouldn't, you know, drag the country into war. So if you look at the target in Erbil, for example, they targeted a civilian's house, which happened to be close, not so far from the American consulate, without, you know, targeting any American asset or personnel there. So, you know, this is the sort of kind of predicament that Iran is right now. On one side, it feels the pressure not only in the sense of the events happening in the region, but also in the sense that, you know, even its own support base in the country, you know, the most hardline part of the society, you know, has been showing kind of, how to say, unhappiness, let's say, with Iran's lack of a strong response or a firm response to the events in the region. And also, Iran has been in a situation where all of its allies in this so-called axis of resistance have been escalating against the United States, and Iran was just sitting watching this. So Iran had to act, but keeping the balance between doing something and doing it in a way that would not, you know, put you in a war is a very, very difficult thing that is getting more and more difficult, I would say.
Well, I mean, if this current pattern of escalation persists, it's very hard to imagine that we won't have some kind of kinetic confrontation between the United States and Iran at some point, and let's hope that can be avoided, because that's not going to make things better necessarily either.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really, really scary time, isn't it? Thank you so much, Hamid Reza, for joining us today, and keep up the fantastic work.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be on your podcast and be cooperating with Al-Monitor.
Thank you. Welcome to On the Middle East, Ina.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, you are one of the biggest experts on these Shia militias in Iraq. And the big question that's out there right now after the deaths of these 3 US servicemen in Jordan is whether these militias who are being held responsible and indeed claimed responsibility for these killings, whether they were acting on their own or whether they were acting under orders from Tehran.
I think the most important aspect when discussing the escalation is its origin, whether it emanates directly from Iranian orders or from Iran's regional allies. The increased lethality in the recent attacks suggests a bold shift by Iran's transnational allies. And also, as you're asking me about their autonomy, operating under the label of the Islamic resistance in Iraq, these actors also strategically shield formal entities that are within the umbrella of the popular mobilization forces, known in Arabic as Hashd al-Shabi. And this also grants Iran plausible deniability, right? We remember also the last speeches of Hassan Nasrallah, but you also see it in the talking points of a lot of resistance veterans. Like, for example, Abu Ala al-Walai has been constantly repeating that whatever the Islamic resistance in Iraq is doing in terms of domestic operations, in terms of transnational engagement, is still emanating from their interests and from their interpretation of the mandate to practice responsibility to resist in whatever context. So this allows them, in my opinion, to test the waters without direct accountability and still maintaining this narrative that Iran merely provides training, guidance, even cheering, rather than explicit orders to proxies. Because of their domestic audiences and also because of their domestic interests, they do not want to be perceived as Iranian proxies. They still want to preserve this identity as Iraqi patriots. And a lot of them, this is really based on my personal interviews with resistance commanders, believe that whatever Iran is doing on the transnational front is also in the best interest of Iraq as a sovereign country.
Well, that's very interesting, because is it really in the interest of Iraq to chase out US forces when we know that the minute US forces leave, the Islamic State will be back to fill that vacuum, perhaps not as quickly as they did the last time round, but the Islamic State is still alive and kicking. So should that not be a concern, especially for Iran itself, which was just attacked recently by the Islamic State, losing hundreds of its citizens in that attack?
That's a crucial point here, and specifically the timing is very important, because all of this is taking place after a first round of negotiations between Sudanese government and the US have been taken place to discuss the future of the US-led global coalition to fight ISIS. So the interest of Sudanese administration lies, of course, in securing credits for a US withdrawal, to be, of course, like the one Iraqi prime minister who has sought through the leaving or the withdrawing of US forces, that still appears diplomatically graceful while maintaining security cooperation with the US, which, as you pointed out, is of vital interest for Iraq's security. So on the one hand, as I mentioned, we have like this legacy of overseeing a withdrawal, which aligns with Sudanese objectives, seeking ongoing security assistance and also bilateral cooperation agreements with countries members of the global coalition to fight ISIS. But also I would say that it would be naive to think that ISIS lurking in the shadows would not be keen to exploit any security gaps, potentially leading to a breakdown in security and counterterrorism efforts and also intelligence cooperation in the region. And this makes the balancing act of Sudanese administration a very difficult one.
Well, at the same time, you know, where would these US troops be directing this cooperation that they're seeking from? Would it be from Iraqi territory still? I mean, how would that even work?
The most important point here is to have an Iraqi government who can guarantee the security of all the personnel, of all the commissioned staff of this global coalition during the whole transition period. And we also have to take into consideration that the whole camp of Iran-aligned actors in Iraq is not as homogeneous as it has been sometimes referred in the media, right? As like having almost unanimously operating group of Iran-sponsored militias. Some of them have bigger stakes in the current administration. Some of them are more established and also like more formally embedded within Iraq's bureaucracy. And others like Al-Nujaba movement or Kataib Sa'id al-Shuhada, they're of course bolder in their statements. They would tend to put in practice much bolder moves to test the waters without necessarily jeopardizing the presence of their forces within the popular mobilization forces. And this makes it, of course, very difficult for the US to decide the most adequate response and, of course, like to win time in the process. It would mean really reacting in a way, drawing red lines, but without necessarily alienating allies that they might have within the current Iraqi government.
That's an excellent point. And of course, we mustn't forget about the Iraqi Kurds who are absolutely, desperate to have US forces stay inside the country. And one of the ideas that seems to be floating around is that while the United States would perhaps thin its presence in areas controlled by the central government, they might shift the focus to the KRG from where they would then, do those anti-ISIS operations. But my understanding is, of course, that that's the last thing Iran wants, is more US in the KRG, because they find the KRG to be the most threatening part, the sort of Achilles heel, because they seem absolutely convinced, however much the KRG denies it, that Israel is sort of using that as a sort of a launching pad to destabilize Iran. So it's a very complex situation.
It's a very complex situation. And just to add on this point, because you brought already excellent arguments, but then additionally, we have the US elections and we have a lot of domestic pressure in the US vis-a-vis the Biden administration to prove that it can indeed protect the lives of US military personnel. And in view of Iran's presence in the KRG, this is also a critical question, whether they have enough ability to draw and maintain these red lines in the north of Iraq.
Where do the Sunnis come into play here? And being that we also know that the original Iraqi resistance to the US came really from the Sunnis, right?
I mean, having come back also recently from field work in Sunni majority provinces, it's very difficult to also speak of the Sunni components as of like one acting and operating and like speaking with a unified voice, right? What Iran has been exploiting were exactly tensions, rivalries, even like not within just like one and the same Sunni community, but like even within one and the same tribe. Just to bring some background information here, within the so-called popular mobilization forces, you have a Sunni component, but you also have like Sunni fighters who have been drawn like to participate in some of the more established Shia majority brigades. All of this like fragmentation has made it quite challenging, like for the Sunni component, like to decide on and to agree on one path, not to mention like the very the psychological effect of taking or arguing any position in favor of the US against the background of the ongoing war in Gaza and of the civilian casualties on the Palestinian side.
My final question is, can you just explain to us why this Kataib al-Hezbollah in particular seems to be in the forefront of all these attacks against the United States? Why are they special, if that's the right word?
Kataib Hezbollah, even though as a lot of the other factions are ideologically aligned with Iran, are one of the strongest factions within the so-called like popular mobilization forces cosmology. They have been operating for a long time behind the shadows, and they have established an intimidating repressive apparatus. Kataib Hezbollah members should not just be perceived as a military component. They have outreach like within the civil society. They have presence also in other security agencies of the Iraqi state, in other administrative bodies. So they are a massive and very serious actor within the Iraqi political landscape. Therefore, also in terms of their ideological makeup, they're very different, like from the Sadri strand. In other papers, I have argued that there have been more ideological differences between Ashab Ahl al-Haq as a faction that has originated from within the Sadri strand, and Kataib Hezbollah, which has been more classically referred to as an Iranian aligned group, as an Iranian proxy. So we have to keep all of these nuances in mind. And then again, like when a major geopolitical issue, a major transnational issue like the Palestinian cause is in the center of the public debates, you would necessarily see a rally around the resistance flag effect. So it would be very difficult, despite, of course, evident tensions, rivalries, disagreements between all of these different actors, to contradict each other, that it is not important to resist or to engage in resistance against what is happening on the Palestinian front.
As I was mentioning to Hamid Reza in my conversation with him, though, it seems rather convenient, though, this October 7th, doesn't it? Because after all, these attacks on US forces predate October 7th, and we all know that the ultimate goal is to drive out the United States. You know, I said this was going to be my previous question was the final one, but here's the final one. Do you think that the United States can remain in Iraq and Syria given this sustained campaign, which shows no sign of abating?
Well, it very much depends in which form and in which function. I would rather say like form should follow function. Therefore, I regard the ongoing talks with the Iraqi government as extremely important. This process ideally like should not be derailed by the last attacks. There is, of course, a strong expectation vis-a-vis the Sudani government to exert pressure on armed actors, especially like acting and operating from Iraqi territory. But I think like once there is a broader consensus on what the global coalition has achieved, what remains to be achieved, what are the tasks, like what is the amount of the current threat being posed by ISIS and by other terrorist elements, then it would be easier for any Iraqi administration to impose a unified position and like to keep such rogue actors in place. Because we have, I just want to point one more aspect out. Even during like the last public funerals after US attack, Kataib Hezbollah strongholds, you would see like that the coffin had been dressed up with the flag of the Hashd al-Shabi. So a lot of these actors, whenever being attacked by the US, they want to fall onto their state actor identity. They want to make it that any attack against them is an attack against Iraqi sovereignty. So I think this is very important point. Like the US has to find a way, like to guarantee the security of its staff without engaging in operations that can be framed by these rogue actors as attacks on Iraqi sovereignty, in order not to jeopardize the current negotiations about the future of the global coalition in Iraq.
But that seems almost impossible because, I mean, these groups are attacking US forces and now killing them. So how can the United States not respond, if not by force? Because the United States has to maintain its credibility. It has to maintain deterrence. So it's just a vicious cycle, isn't it? Because
it's a vicious cycle, and it's a cycle that can only be broken through more intensified cooperation with the Iraqi authorities, especially like with members of the current administration who would have like direct channels on how to engage like with such rogue elements.
Well, we're all waiting with bated breath to see what exactly the US response that Biden vowed would happen will be, what form it will take. Let's hope that things don't get even more violent, but unfortunately, that's the trend. Thank you so very much, Ina, and I'm sorry I kept you on for so long. I know you have a lot of other things to do, but I could go on forever talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to our next conversation.
And this brings us to the end of this week's program. I hope you found it informative and that you will keep tuning in to On the Middle East. Thank you and goodbye.